Well, it's 6:30. Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give just a minute or so just for people to join in. Otherwise, I don't want to start too abruptly. Okay. I'm sure as I begin, more people will join. It's always a bit strange talking to a computer screen and not seeing anyone. That's not, as a teacher, that's not usually how I like to do things, but also allows us to bring people in from different parts of the country to join in the conversations and also to present, especially during these winter months. So I'm really grateful for that. So welcome to part 3. So I know some folks have joined us right from the beginning. It's a 4-part series, and so for some of you, it's going to be your first time joining us. So welcome. My name is Martin Tamlin, and I manage the Old Growth Forest Project at the Ignatius Jesuit Centre, the north end of Guelph, Ontario. The Old Growth Forest Project is a protected piece of land, 100 acres of land. That's a kind of a sanctuary for people and animals, really. And so the purpose of the project is to, with the help of the community and volunteers and school kids and lots of people to learn how to do it. So there's restoring the land, but there's also restoring our connection to the land. So there's many wonderful things that happen and trails that get used all year round. The Old Growth Forest Project is one initiative of the many great initiatives that take place at the Ignatius Jesuit Centre that kind of leads us towards a more ecological and sustainable way of being in this world and building community in the meantime. The centre cultivates spiritual growth and ecological engagement, valuing creation, compassion, diversity, ecological sustainability, interfaith connections, social justice, and life as a spiritual journey. We commit to a deep truth and reconciliation, acknowledging these lands of the Anishinaabe, neutral and Haudenosaunee people and Métis peoples. We honor and respect the land, the water, the plants, the animals, and the ancestors. And also acknowledge, as treaty people, we're called to understand the histories and the teachings and the responsibilities of being here on these lands and being good treaty people and taking care. So with that, we continue in deep spirit of gratitude for the sacred land we're speaking from today. I'm grateful for this opportunity to hear folks that have spent, in many cases, like most of their lives, dedicated to taking care of this beautiful world of ours. And the opportunity to kind of learn and connect and collaborate with all these different people and share with you. And also would like to say gratitude for the Ontario Trillium Foundation that have provided the funds in order to go on this incredible journey over the last year and a half, and to start a journey that will continue in collaboration in caring for our common home. This program is a program in holistic restoration. And so it's been a journey. It takes in all aspects of and many different perspectives on that journey of connecting with the land, learning how to take care of it, and actually collaborating with each other and moving forward in action, because that's really what's really important and urgent and needed right now. The course has been described as a braided journey. It's also described as a two-eyed framework of seeing. So for those who don't know what that means, braiding is taking these perspectives. You can imagine kind of a braided rope. It's not trying to assimilate and create something new, but those individual strands of different ways of seeing the world and knowing, been brought together, make something much stronger. The two-eyed seeing is another way of looking at things where you're seeing something from a kind of Western scientific perspective or an Indigenous perspective as well in how we approach not only reconciliation with each other and also the land. Yeah, so tonight the theme is caring for the land. And through this course and many of the teachings, when we speak of land, it's land with a capital L, and land actually encompasses everything. So that's water, land, air, creatures, rocks. In fact, all of creation. So that's what we mean by land. I'm excited to have some great presenters tonight as we look into restoration, understanding restoration ecology, forest systems, waterways, and also the essential work that's going on in Wickwemicon on protecting species at risk. So I'm really glad to hear these presenters. So welcome, Zach, Jack, and Theodore. I'm going to hand over to Molly now, one of my colleagues, who's going to do some housekeeping with you, and then we'll get into our discussions. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you really get a lot out this evening. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Molly Fisher. I'm the Old Growth Forest Project Assistant. For those of you who've tuned in to the past one or two of the past sessions, this will be a little bit of a repeat, but we do have some new people tonight, as Martin was saying. So just some housekeeping before we hop into our first speaker. There will be a Q&A session at the presentations tonight. So if you have questions during their presentations or just following, we just ask that you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can submit those questions throughout, or you can save them until the end. And whatever time we have left, we will use that as a panel for all of the speakers to answer your questions. If you have any comments during the presentations that you'd like to share with everybody, you can use the chat function at the side of the screen. If you have any specific questions or comments or concerns about how Zoom is functioning, you can select to send your message to hosts and panelists, and Patrick or I will address your question and concern. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. You are not being recorded because your cameras and microphones are not accessible, but this will be made available to you following the webinar. It'll be sent out in an email with all of the resources that are mentioned tonight in all of the presentations, and a Google form that will be for your own reflection and just some guiding questions to help you pursue these topics further, and also for us to receive feedback from you and just see what people are learning or thinking about following the webinar. So we thank you for filling out the past two forms. Those are still available if any of you attended the last two webinars and would like to go back and reflect on some of those questions. So I think that you would have received the link to the past two, as well as the one for tonight in the email with the Zoom link. We'll also be sending it out after, just in case those emails get shuffled in your inbox. As we all know, that happens. So if you have any other concerns or questions throughout, again, just use the chat function. Questions go in the Q&A box, and you'll receive an email afterward. And without further ado, I would like to jump into the first session tonight. So I'll introduce Zack Harris. Zack is a botanist, ecologist, and consulting arborist with 13 years of experience in ecological consulting in Southern Ontario. The focus of his work has been on species at risk surveys, environmental impact studies, tree preservation plans, and monitoring ecological restoration sites. Zack is co-owner of Origin Native Plants, a native plant nursery located at the Ignatius Jesuit Center. So Zack, you're welcome to turn your camera on, and I'll pass this over to you.
Thank you, Molly. Just going to share my screen here. Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about ecological restoration from my perspective as an ecologist and arborist, and someone who's always been very interested in ecological restoration and how it's done. So for this presentation, it's really an overview of ecological restoration, what it is, why it's important, and the process or the steps that we undertake in figuring out how to restore an ecosystem. so to start with, the
Sorry.
Society for...
Sorry to interrupt you, Zach.
Yep.
I don't think, I'm not sure if other people can see it. I don't see your screen being shared right now.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Give me 1 second here. How's that?
Much better.
Perfect.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so I just went through this slide here, the overview of the presentation. So what is ecological restoration? It's as defined by the Society for Ecological Restoration. It's a process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, destroyed to its former state. And that's kind of a narrow, somewhat of a narrow definition, particularly part about former state. And I'm going to kind of compare and contrast this definition to some similar terms as we go through. But before we get there, why do we need ecological restoration? Well, we, as residents of Southern Ontario or Canada at large, development is obviously a significant driver of change in the landscape. In terms of causing destruction, removing habitat. There's certainly a legacy of degraded urban systems from past methods of urban planning and development, in particular urban watercourses, which are quite often eroded. They don't connect to the floodplains. And so the services provided by these features are highly degraded with respect to, or in comparison to, a healthy sort of natural system. We also think about habitat fragmentation. So at the landscape scale, how can we connect features on the landscape like wetlands, woodlands? The image I'm showing here is on the right is from the city of Guelph's natural heritage system, and on the left is the exact same spot but an aerial image. And as you can see, there's these big patches of green, which are these core areas comprised of woodlands and wetlands, and the city has sort of sketched in areas in brown for where that are high priority areas for linking these features together. The little purple area at the bottom there, if you can see that, is actually designated for restoration. So ecological restoration also aims to, can have goals at a landscape scale to essentially stitch together the landscape that's been fragmented through urban development and historic agriculture as well. Another focus of ecological restoration can be invasive species. So invasive species are those often exotic species that are not native to Ontario or North America, depending on the scale you're looking at. And they often displace our native flora and fauna. There's some really nasty ones out there like common reed, shown in the picture on the far left. Norway maple on the far right, which is a very commonly planted species and grows quite readily in urban ravines and woodlands, and outcompetes our native species. So ecological restoration can focus very much on removing or managing for invasive species itself. Ecological restoration can also be a tool for education and interpretation. So restoring ecosystems can be a way of exploring how they function and even demonstrate these properties, whether it's a small wetland feature or tall grass prairie restoration. It provides a way to educate the public or other practitioners in the values, understanding the values of these ecosystems and how they can be recreated. And certainly conservation is a big one as well. We have lots of rare, uncommon, at-risk species in Ontario, And one of the big drivers of the loss of these species is that they don't have any habitat, but they don't have enough habitat to maintain viable populations, or maybe the habitat is degraded such that it doesn't meet the needs of for their life cycle. Maybe they can't find food, or there are certain structures to the habitat that are no longer present that we might want to restore to help restore those populations of at-risk species. And so in this image here, it's showing a grassland bird called bobolink. It's native to Ontario, and it likes open grasslands, even hay fields. And so one of the ways to conserve that species is to plant native grasslands. So going back to the concept of ecological restoration, the definition I provided talked about restoring an ecosystem and its functions to a historic state. But that often isn't realistic for various reasons. Maybe the site you're working with is so highly degraded that it would either take so long or so much time and effort to bring it to its historic state that it's just not feasible. There are, in my mind, ecological restoration also involves bringing areas to a state where you're restoring the benefits or the ecosystem services that you would get from, say, native grassland, an untouched grassland or woodland or something like that. So the Society for Ecological Restoration's definition is really focused on that historic state, but sometimes alternate states are just as good because they provide all the benefits that those untouched prairies or woodlands have, or they provide almost the same benefits. So there are some similar terms that you'll quite often see. Naturalization, and that's essentially incorporating natural elements into a degraded site. So that could include planting native species into an old field that is dominated by exotic species, just to enhance the habitat for pollinators or for grassland birds or open country birds, something like that. And on the sort of the farthest end of the spectrum, landscaping, it's typically, it can include native species, for instance, or elements of habitat, even a bird box or something like that. But they're typically in a more formal commercial residential setting. And it's really more about aesthetics than it is about function often. Although more and more we hear about landscaping, for pollinators or rain gardens for helping with infiltrating rainwater and stuff like that. So it's not to say that there aren't important functional aspects to landscaping as well. It's just typically in more of a formal setting. So looking at the process of ecological restoration from a science perspective, I just like to go through what I consider the sort of key steps. And depending on what you read or where you are, there's variations on this process. But I think I sort of distilled it down to the main points here. So the first is the site assessment, then establishing reference conditions, defining goals, objectives, and targets, planning the restoration, and the implementation, which is probably the funnest part, getting your hands dirty, and then lastly, monitoring. And I'm going to go through each of these and sort of elaborate a little bit. So site assessment, I think, is, along with the goals and objectives, is one of the most important steps. It's where you understand the site that you're looking to restore. What kind of soils are there? Are they heavy clay soils that don't let water infiltrate very quickly, or are they coarse sandy soils and water flows right into the ground? Is your site receiving water from the surrounding landscape, or is it at a high point and all the water is shedding away from that? In which case it might be a very dry site that would be suitable for a particular plant community, for instance. Is there any vegetation or elements of this area that should be retained because they have value, ecological value? And also, we in Southern Ontario in particular, there's a extensive history of human occupation on this landscape, and humans leave their mark, of course. And so there may be important historical or cultural elements to that landscape that should be incorporated into your ecological restoration design. So once you understand the site that you're working with, the next step is to figure out some sort of reference condition that you can use to guide your restoration. Sometimes this is referred to as a target community if you're talking about just about vegetation. So this might include, if you've got a site, for instance, on a moraine with really dry, sandy soils, you might look to other ecosystems or vegetation communities that occur on those sites, like, for instance, tall grass prairies. There's not many left in Ontario, for instance, now, but historically they occurred all across dry, well-drained uplands in Southern Ontario. So this gives you this kind of this reference system that you look to work towards. You look at what species occur there, so you know perhaps what sort of seeds to sow or plants to put in the ground, or what sort of wildlife you're looking to attract and provide habitat elements for. The goals, objectives, and targets. This is very important because it really frames your ecological restoration project and ensures that you as an ecologist, I like to think about, planting rare species and, pulling out all the stops to make a really awesome ecosystem. But you really need sort of a set of goals to guide you, to keep you on track, and also to come back to later when you're evaluating your site to see if you actually were successful in your restoration. So this is a sort of an arbitrary example, but your goal might be to provide foraging habitats for birds of prey, like maybe a red-tailed hawk or something like that. The objective would be to install some dead trees or snags, which they like to perch on so they can see around and find their prey. And then the target or the metric by which you're measuring success would be that you see red-tailed hawks, regularly using those dead trees for a number of years, maybe 3 years or whatever it is. This is a little bit arbitrary, but to provide you an example. So the next phase is planning and design. And this is where all these concepts are fleshed out in some sort of written plan, or even a detailed, like a landscape drawing, like I'm showing here. It could be, show exactly which species to put in the ground where. And this really depends, the level of detail here really depends on your goals and objectives, the complexity of your site. Maybe a sort of back of the napkin or rough notebook sketch is all you need for a particular site. Just something to lay down those ideas and have a reference, a visual or written reference to work with, sort of a, like a recipe book in a way. The implementation, this is where, like I said, you get your hands dirty, get plants in the ground. This is the success of your project is really getting the implementation right is really key for the success of your project. You need to think about when to plant. If you're planting trees and shrubs, or if you're seeding, you might need to do those activities at different times of the year to ensure that the vegetation is going to establish properly. There's a lot of work involved as well. So coordinating contractors and volunteers to bring all of this planning to fruition is incredibly important, and that's the making the restoration happen on the ground. Lastly, the monitoring. So this is where you go back and you look at your restoration site. You see what's there. Could be I'm showing here. This is from a particular site I worked on where we've gone back every few years and we've looked at exactly what's growing on the ground in this meadow restoration every 2 years, and we've compared that to what was on the plant list or what was seeded there in the first place to see, did we see all 25 of those species show up? And they're depending on what your goals and objectives and targets are. The monitoring can be a number of different things. For instance, for wetlands, it could be looking at how the water levels change throughout the year, and does that line up with your reference site? A wetland down the street that you're using to compare your site to, and perhaps most importantly, the monitoring is incredibly important for identifying issues so that you can go back and maybe try to fix those. So adaptive management. Do we need to go back and replant, because all of the saplings died or the seed didn't take? And this is where monitoring is really kind of ties back into your design and your goals and objectives, and lets you sort of correct course. So that is ecological restoration in a nutshell, the very basics of it. And just before I move on to talking more specifically about forest restoration, I just wanted to highlight the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is an international organization. They've got a lot of really great resources, books, journal articles, training programs, certifications, and it's just a really great resource if you want to learn more about ecological restoration from the theory to the actual application. So let's take a closer look at restoring forests.
Hey, Zach, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Sure. Yeah.
So we've got these black boxes that I think may be your Zoom stuff over top of your slides here. If you could just reshare your screen and try to click the actual window that the slide is on, the slideshow is on, rather than the actual full screen, I think that might help.
Okay, let's try this again.
So you'd be looking for share screen and then the PowerPoint itself.
Yeah, it's
Oh, you just narrowed one of them down.
Yeah, for some reason they're floating on top of the presentation. They weren't doing that initially. I'm not sure how to see if I can drag this out of the way. There we go. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
That looks great. Thank you.
How are we doing for time right now?
We're good. We're good.
Okay, excellent. So restoring forests. I'm just going to talk about what a forest is, the different types of forests in Ontario and the benefits they provide, why we want to restore forests, and just take a look at some of the techniques and methods that are involved in forest restoration. So within the context of Ontario, a forest is a terrestrial vegetation community with at least 60% tree cover. I think everyone intuitively knows what a forest is, dominated by large woody plants, pretty much wherever you go. And forests are sort of the maturest phase of what we call ecological succession. So that changing over time of plant communities naturally as plants disperse in and things grow up. In Ontario anyway, there's some variation around the world, but we generally see this sort of steady climb to larger, more mature trees, a more developed forest canopy with different layers and structure to it. And this can take hundreds of years, really. On this diagram, this is 100 years, but sometimes, I've seen forests that are 100 years old and they don't look like an old growth forest at all. So it can take hundreds and hundreds of years to really reach this sort of climax type of community. There's some variation in the concept of a forest, though, or a woodland or a treed community. And so across the spectrum of forest cover, we've got savannas, which are sort of like overgrown meadows, 25 to 35% tree cover. Then woodlands occupy that mid-range of 35 to 60, and finally forests have the most dense tree cover. That middle photo doesn't really do woodlands justice. That's really more of a forest or a plantation. But you can imagine this sort of continuum of canopy cover. In Ontario, there are several broad zones where forests occur. The Carolinian Zone is dominated by deciduous trees, incredibly diverse. In fact, some of the most diverse ecosystems in Ontario. And I'll show you a map of where these occur. As we move north into central Ontario, we've got the Great Lakes St. Lawrence system where we get more conifers. We move on to the Canadian Shield where there's more bedrock and less deep mineral soil, different soil chemistry. And then at the farthest north, we have the boreal forest, which is dominated by spruce and pine trees, mostly conifers. And so this just shows you kind of where these three broad zones are across Ontario. And these are really, it's really important to understand if you're thinking about restoring forests in Ontario, where you are in relation to these, because that really determines the sort of species that are going to work at your site. If you're in, say, Sudbury, planting something like a tulip tree or a black gum is probably not going to work because those are naturally restricted to the deep south of Ontario. Forests provide a lot of benefits, both economic and social and cultural, ecological services. So obviously, they're important for wood and fuel and hunting, but they're also incredibly important for maintaining water quality. So filtering nutrients out of the water, storing carbon, and then certainly last but not least, social and cultural benefits. There's nothing like going for a hike through the forest to connect with nature. Within the urban context, having an urban canopy is really known to reduce stress, improve air quality. If you don't have access to get outside of the city into nature, urban forest can be a really important place for people to just connect with nature. And of course, cultural benefits. There's perhaps historic religious or cultural values associated with forests. And I mentioned the mental health benefits as well, but certainly reducing stress and anxiety. So we think about the history of forests in Ontario. The forests we have now are really just a fragment of what was here historically. In the last about 150 years ago, there was widespread deforestation. And since then, there's been this sort of slow reclamation of forests and marginal farmlands and those those back 40 woodlots have sort of slowly spread out. But it's really nothing like it was historically. And so in addition to just not having as much forest, we don't have the same we're not getting the same sort of benefits that we would have historically from forests as well. And so that's a really important driver of why we restore forests. And so before we talk specifically about forest restoration, I just want to touch on 3 concepts that are important in forest ecology, or one overarching concept, that is disturbance. And disturbance is really any sort of perturbation or sort of an event that happens in a forest or in any ecosystem that can reset that successional timeline. So bring a treat area back to, a blank space, so to speak. There are some broad categories of disturbance. Fire. We hear about forest fires all the time in British Columbia, Northern Ontario, all over the world. And those are, there's issues with fire suppression and that sort of style of forest management. But fires are very much a natural part of forest ecology. In fact, some species rely on forests, like jack pines, for instance, to open their cones, which releases the seeds and lets new jack pines grow. Wind is at a more of a local scale is very important for punching holes in the forest canopy by knocking down trees, which lets a different group of species come up through that canopy and regenerate. So if you've been in a deciduous forest and you see a patch of black cherry, there's probably a good chance that there was a gap in that canopy at some time, and those cherries, took advantage of that light and grew up through there. And also water or flooding is another important form of disturbance. So specifically changes in water over time, or hydrology, as we refer to it in ecology. And when areas become wetter, you start to see the plants that were there before die off and get replaced by a new set of plants. So there's this sort of temporal or over time aspect to forests as well, and that really they're constantly changing over time. There's succession, and then there's disturbances that come in and provide opportunity for diversity and more complexity in those forest ecosystems. So we talked a little bit about habitat fragmentation. Again, with forests, really stitching those forest communities together on the landscape, enhancing those connections is very important, and that's often a main goal in forest restoration. That sort of landscape scale view of vegetation cover. Of course, connectivity at the landscape allows movement of wildlife across the land, dispersal of plants and other small animals as well. So there are different, getting down to, what is forest restoration? Well, it really depends on your starting conditions. If you're looking to grow a forest from the field, it's a lot different than taking a woodland that's been degraded, maybe cut over, but there's still trees left. These require different levels of effort, from, a do nothing approach where basically you just kind of watch it grow and make sure that the desirable species are coming up, to putting seeds in the ground, trees, acorns, the whole sort of 9 yards. And so there are different levels of effort and sort of complexity to forest restoration. The techniques we use to restore forests are also related to that. So if you've got a particular forest that's overgrown by an invasive species like common buckthorn, then maybe the first step in restoring that forest is removing the buckthorn to allow the native species to come back. There could be erosion issues. I talked about urban water courses and how degraded those are, how much erosion there is relative to a healthy stream that's a little bit more stable. And so another if we're talking about trying to create a diverse forest ecosystem, then I think one of the most important things to consider is topography or microtopography. So old growth forests are very complex in terms of the ground surface. Over decades or hundreds of years, you get trees overturning and pulling up soil, what we call pit and mound topography. And that creates opportunities for a larger number of species to inhabit that forest space. And instead of just planting out a smooth field, you can ensure more species diversity, more complexity in the long term by creating more microtopography from the start. So quite often a forest restoration project will start by literally digging pits and piling it up, so that you have that topographic complexity from the start. And then there's also site preparation as well. Sometimes there's, in addition to just removing undesirable vegetation, you need to prepare the ground surface for planting, whether it's seeding or putting in trees. We also look at creating wildlife habitat within forests or through forest restoration. So this graphic here just shows it's sort of a cross section through a riparian zone, or where a stream flows through the forest. And it illustrates some ways in which you can create habitats for specific species. So on the right, snake hibernaculum, which is digging out a pit below the frost line and filling it with rubble so that snakes can get in there in the winter below the frost line and hibernate. Actually burying a big dead tree so that raptors like hawks or other birds can come, and quite often they'll forage elsewhere. They'll poop there on site and drop the seeds there, and so and that's a way for plants to disperse along the landscape. So sometimes creating these unique habitat features in a way can accelerate ecological succession in a restored area by welcoming in the wildlife that are going to help facilitate the establishment of other plants as well. And vernal pools are important for breeding amphibians as well. And that could be as simple as excavating a low-lying area that's going to receive water so that it stays flooded for a certain period in the year and lets those amphibians come in and breed. So this is just another layer of complexity to restoring forests beyond just putting trees in the ground. So if we have time, I can go through a few case studies here. I see I'm at about half an hour, so but if I need to stop here, that's fine. But one case study I'd like to highlight is the Red Hill Valley restoration. So this is going back to the 2000s. There was so I was involved in this project mostly from the monitoring end of things, not so much the planning and the actual restoration, but I had the fortune of seeing these restored areas kind of grow up over time, over about a 6 or 7 year period. And so this was a very large scale restoration project that involved wetlands, forests, meadows, in these areas that were disturbed from building a highway. In some cases, in other cases, restoring old stream beds where the channel was relocated. And I think at the time, anyway, it was one of the largest restoration projects in Canada. So just looking at one particular area, there was a number of upland forests that were restored right on the Niagara Escarpment in Hamilton. And part of the planning process for this was to identify suitable vegetation communities that would work at these sites. And that was done by looking elsewhere along the Niagara Escarpment, seeing what species were growing there, figuring out what sort of density of trees fit that model, and coming up with basically a prescription for these sites based on where they were topographically in the landscape, what sort of moisture regime was there, and then establishing targets. So in this case, the number of trees planted in the ground as a way of evaluating the success of that over time. And this is one of my favorite spots right here, because I was there on the day that they put those trees in the ground on the photo on the left. So all those young trees in the background are Eastern cottonwood. There's a large black walnut just to the right, which has hardly changed over the 4-year period that these photos were taken. But you can see, based on the photo on the right, that those cottonwood and I think some sycamore saplings, quadrupled in size over that period in time. And that's because they chose species that were suited to that, in this case, floodplain habitat. They were fast growing, so they quickly established cover, and eventually will allow for other more shade tolerant species to come in there. And lastly, this is another another case study in Hamilton where there was a much smaller scale, but they installed a forest a staircase up the Niagara Escarpment, and you can see over time. I won't get into the details for the sake of time here, but you can see over a period of only a few years that the slope was rapidly revegetated, using a number of different forest species to basically conceal this staircase in an area that was basically cleared out to install it. So I'll leave it at there, because I know I'm way over for time now, and we can move on to the next presenter. That was basically the last slide anyway, so we're good.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. There's a lot of information in that. Thank you for sharing. So next, I'm going to welcome Jack Imhof. Jack has spent over 48 years of his life working on river and watershed restoration. He specializes in restoration ecology, watershed science and management, and natural channel design. He helped to develop the watershed management approach in Ontario, as well as the Natural Channel Systems Initiative. Jack is an active fly fisher for over 50 years and has fished across Canada and the US, as well as England, Australia, and Argentina. He is also a 5th Dan in Yoshinkan Aikido. So welcome, Jack.
Thank you very much, Molly. And thank you again to everyone for the invitation to join all of you and to chat about watersheds and streams. Much of what I'll be talking about harmonizes quite a bit with Zach's previous presentation, and I'm very pleased about that, because I think I'll add some additional aspects to what I consider to be restoration or rehabilitation. And my focus this evening will be specifically on watersheds and their streams and form and their function. Let's see if we can start to see if it'll start to continue. Okay, going to see if that screen, I'm just trying to see if it'll start advancing for me. Reason it's not advanced. There we go. Okay, so my presentation overview, I'll be looking at I should say, now I would say listen to me. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the challenge when it comes to restoration and rehabilitation. I'll talk about what I call the imperative for rehabilitating our landscapes. Zach did a very good job of explaining the importance of restoration and rehabilitation in our landscapes and our waterscapes. I'll just add a little bit to that. I'll talk about the role and application of understanding the context of the locations that you're dealing with and the watershed you're dealing with in order to understand how it's functioning. I'll look at then sort of a scale from a broad scale, from watershed landscape level right down to local systems and how they interrelate. And I'll finish off a little bit with some of the rehabilitation examples as well. First thing I'll just mention is a few folks that know me have seen this one before, and that is the, excuse me here, I seem to be going the wrong direction here. Okay, and we do have a challenge, and I think the biggest challenge that I want to stress to all of you is that we've been here before. This is a cartoon from the Carolinian Conservation Digest from October 1947. It shows in the upper part of a little stream in the 1870s. There's a young lad there with a stringer of fish. There's beautiful forest structure. There's birds flying. There's little critters utilizing the landscape. The fish are abundant. The stream is tight and cool. And now we see the same stream in 1947, and the gentleman is a grandpa, and he's talking to his grandson, saying, "When I was your age, William, a sparkling stream flowed here. What you see is the result of the destruction of the forest and the swamps." I want to emphasize that we know the consequence of changing landscapes and the impact. We just tend to forget every 20, 40, 50 years, and we repeat our mistakes. And I think we're going through that type of cycle again. So, okay, let's take a look at the next slide. My screen seems to be a bit slow. There we go. So what are we trying to do? Well, you're trying to rebuild what I consider our natural infrastructure. And the big issue with rehabilitation is that our rivers and streams and our landscapes are still adjusting from the clearing of the land. And in many cases, we're restoring them, as Zack was demonstrating. In some cases, we are not doing a very good job. Most of our watersheds, which is the land and the water that is bounded by a height of land in which most water flows to a common area like a river, stream, and lake, and eventually flows into a larger lake or an ocean, that's a watershed. Most of our watersheds are not resilient or functioning very well. You'll hear me use the term functioning quite a bit in the next little while. Many of our healthy streams and their corridors, including the healthy riparian areas of forests, grasslands, shrubs, wetlands, are absolutely essential to maintaining the quality of our water and the health of aquatic life and our health. The land itself, of course, sustains us, provides us with food and clean water. We need to rebuild this resiliency, especially with higher climate variability, because ultimately healthy functioning systems sustain us. I talk about rehabilitation, not so much restoration. I think the Ecological Society talks about restoration as returning to some form of healthy previous state. And I think Zack also mentioned that there are some provisions. And my comment to that is that most places in Canada, I think it's unrealistic to think that we can return systems to some form of historical condition. My question is, how far back do you want to go? Our indigenous brothers and sisters have been on this land for almost 10,000 years, and they have been using it and modifying it. So how far back do you want to go is another question. What I'm suggesting and what we're trying to do is trying to rehabilitate as much of the form and function of our landscapes and our streams to make them as healthy and functional as possible, given whatever constraints we can't change. So when it comes to ecological rehabilitation, which is one I focus on in much of my work, context is everything. You have to ask yourself, where am I? What type of system am I dealing with? What type of functions has it had, given the physical and chemical nature of the landscape and how the animals and plants have utilized it? At what scale is the system unhealthy? What level is the system dysfunction that's causing the problems that we see? Because one of the biggest challenges I find, especially when I'm dealing with rivers, streams, and their corridors, is that we quite often treat the effect of a disorder rather than what's causing that disorder. And finally, we're trying to rebuild the system's capability to restore its own critical functions. The guy by the name of Aldo Leopold, one of the sons of guy by the name of Aldo Leopold, who wrote a Sand County Almanac, talks about trying to work with the natural tendencies of the system and provide it with the tools to help itself heal itself. And that's one of the things that I try to utilize in my day-to-day rehabilitation work on our watersheds. I talk about building context. One of the reasons is that we need to understand how the system functions at some level based on its form and its functions, because if we don't understand that, we make poor decisions and poor management decisions, and quite often have unexpected consequences from those bad decisions. So we try to build context so we can understand the form and function of the landscape, where it's damaged. We look at what causes some of those problems and what the responses are to those things so we can understand them. And we explore the range of possible options that we have in order to try to bring it back to as healthy a state as possible. And I quite often say to friends of mine that want to consult folks about restoration, rehabilitation, I say, before you ask them what they want, perhaps you should provide them with what they could have. And then they can make a better choice. So we have to truly have the ability to understand the system we're dealing with. And the problem we face all the time, continuously, is that our piecemeal approach continues to fail, especially with higher climate variability. Our infrastructure is demonstrating that we're not managing our natural system very well because it's damaging quite a bit of our built infrastructure. When we build context, we try to look at it from a variety of scales. Now, I'm looking at watersheds, so I'm looking at land and water together. So that's why I look at watersheds rather than ecoregions per se, only because it helps to harmonize how water is managed by that landscape. I look at different scales. We spend most of our time working at fine scales at the site, and sometimes at a reach of a multiple length of meander pattern of a stream and its riparian zone. But we quite often, in order to put this area in context, we need to understand where it sits within the watershed, where it's positioned, and what may be affecting, what might be happening up here that might be affecting the site down here that we're working on. So we need to be able to look at the lens or the telescope from both ends, from the local end looking up to the watershed, and from the watershed looking down towards the site, so that we can understand where the problems are that we're facing when it comes to restoring some of these water features that we deal with and the landscapes that contribute to that. I just wanted to show you a quick example of looking at from different scales. So when I look at a watershed, I first of all look at its local geology and topography, because that provides the rock and structure that over long periods of time is weathered by climate and provides the soil structure and the topography that's modified by glaciation. The frequent weather patterns over the course of many years creates the opportunity for different types of vegetative cover, landscapes, forests, meadows, wetlands, and so on. And that vegetative cover modifies the water that flows over and through the landscape. And that modification is further modified at the finer levels within the valley, because the valley helps to direct and concentrate surface and groundwater, and providing nutrients and energy and materials both to the riparian areas along a river corridor as well as to the water itself. And finally, at the local level, all those features working at a broader scale creates the site conditions that we quite often see that most of us try to scope our problems around. We're standing there beside the stream, we're looking at the substrate, we're looking at the structure of the riffles, the pools, the riparian vegetation, the forest structure, and so on, the floodplain characteristics, but all of those are driven at a broader scale, and we need to understand the broader scale in order to put the site into context when it comes to trying to restore or rehabilitate the form and function of that area. One of the key aspects that I work on, especially because I focus especially on aquatic systems, is that most of the impacts begin on the land. Now, there's an implicit link between the health of the land and its watershed and the aquatic system. A fellow by the name of Robert Nyman many years ago said the aquatic systems are topographically unique in that they occupy the lowest position in the landscape, thereby integrating catchment or watershed scale processes. Or put it in a simpler way, A stream is only as healthy as the health of the valley and its watershed. So if you want to know how healthy your landscape is, look at how healthy your stream is and what type of animals and plants you find in and beside the stream. That'll tell you how healthy your landscape is. I start by looking again at the geology of an area only because it determines the potential for how the watershed manages water. It manages that water both over the surface and through the ground, modified by the land cover or the forests and areas that are found, the vegetation that is found on that. The geology also determines the chemical makeup of your water. It determines how much sediment is moved off the landscape into river systems, which dictates the type of substrate you find in your streams. Ultimately, the geology also determines the shape and character of the water bodies you work on, where their potential locations are, and ultimately the distribution of different animal communities like fish. And as well, determines the opportunities for those communities of animals and plants that are associated within those areas. One of the ways I look at watershed form and function is looking at two major pathways. So one is the water cycle, which is the hydrologic pathway. So when I'm working on trying to look at restoring aquatic systems within a watershed, I first of all try to get a very, very rough water budget for the landscape. What's the annual precipitation rate? What type of land cover do I have? How healthy are the forests? How much evaporation or transpiration can I be getting from those landscapes? How much surface runoff do I get? How much groundwater capability does it have from a standpoint of infiltration? So that helps me to understand what type of system I'm dealing with from the standpoint of a water budget. The other pathway I look at is what's called the ecological pathway within the valley, which is the relationship between how water moves downslope, carrying water and nutrients and sediment and critters in many cases, how it moves from the headwaters to the river mouth, how animals can move from the river mouth or estuaries up into the watershed. It also talks about the interaction of the river and its riparian area, because it's a two-way street. Water can move in both directions into a riparian area and out through a riparian area, carrying water and nutrients, organic material, critters, as well as riparian area, or I should say the river and its floodplain. And finally, the river and its groundwater. So all of those work together, are nested together to give us an explanation of what type of system we're dealing with at any location within that watershed. The other thing I start to look at a finer scale then are the rivers themselves and their associated wetlands. I sometimes say the rivers are the children of the watershed, and animals like fish are the children of the river. Fish have very little control over their environment, and such they're victims, or if you will, of the conditions and characteristics of the land and how it delivers water, nutrients, sediment, and other materials to the water. When we're dealing with rivers themselves, rivers are dynamic systems. They tend to move around and adjust themselves over time. Many people, especially those that like to work on aquatic systems and like like rivers and streams, think of how important river habitat is at low flow, which is the minimum living space that the animals have to survive in any particular year. However, that low flow channel and its characteristics is driven by the high flow characteristics of a river, something called the bank full discharge, which is when the river does work. It moves water, nutrients, and sediments and readjusts its channel form and shape. If one were to look at form and function of a channel, one sees that channels and rivers are not stochastic in their features and characteristics. They have repeating sequences. Those repeating sequences are a way a river dissipates energy during high flows, both through increasing a path of movement called meanders back and forth that reduces reduces energy. So it manages energy during a flood by bouncing from side to side. It also carries sediment. The areas of highest erosion are usually at the bends of a river. That's in part how it maintains and creates its meanders. And the area of deposition during high flows are the riffles. That's why you have riffles. So if you think of rivers dissipating energy during high flow, they dissipate it in two vectors, if you will. They dissipate it horizontally, which creates the meander pattern and is repeating sequences of riffles, runs, pools, flats, riffles, runs, pools, and flats. But they also have a repeating sequence vertically. If one considers riffles coming down into a pool, depositing materials during high flow to create a new riffle, and then another pool and riffle, you basically have a vertical meander pattern. This creates enormous amounts of variety of habitats, structures, sediments, and how things are sorted that animals can utilize for their life cycle. So healthy river systems are very important in maintaining diverse habitats for multiple species, whether they're fish, amphibians, bugs, or other types of critters. The other important element to a watershed and a river is its riparian area. Healthy riparian zones encourage the river to develop a narrower and deeper profile, which creates what I call excellent channel heterogeneity. In other words, you have deep pools and shallow riffles, where the riparian areas have, and the riparian areas hold these banks in place by their roots. Roots are critically important from a biological and from a geophysical standpoint in maintaining healthy channel forms and structures. So a healthy riparian area is critically important to a healthy stream, just as a healthy riparian area is critically important to wetland areas as well, or in many cases, healthy old growth forests. So some of these functions of healthy riparian areas includes flow management. During high water, the water moves into these riparian areas, is slowed down, nutrients are captured and transformed in those areas. The banks are stable because of the deep roots. The shape of the channel is improved because it has forced to scour and create those meander patterns vertically and horizontally in an efficient way. And it also provides food sources, migration corridors, and habitat for all sorts of life. But riparian areas are also what I call the kidneys of a stream. A healthy functional riparian area can capture enormous amounts of nutrients and transform them into vegetation, seeds, berries, and other materials that are then utilized by terrestrial animals for their food. So you get a very complex food web into these systems. When I look at what happens when we disrupt the water cycle of an area, there's a variety of things. Now, how do we disrupt the water cycle of an area? Clear cutting a forest is one way. Agriculture and agricultural drainage can change the water cycle in an area, and especially urbanization, because we create massive impervious surfaces which do not mimic natural processes anymore. We have in a healthy temperate watershed that is dominated by healthy forests, on average, on an annual basis, anywhere from 65 to 70% of the water that falls as precipitation over the course of a year is transpired back into the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration. Another major component is infiltrated as shallow or deep groundwater, and a modest amount of it flows over the surface occasionally. On the other hand, is urbanization, where the vast majority of water that falls from the sky into an urban area runs off. When that happens, that the river now has a fundamental change in its hydrology, the term that Zach mentioned earlier, which means that the flood flow frequencies increase, their magnitude increases, their frequency increases, duration shortens, but the amount of power increases, and the time of change is very, very rapid. All of that leads to changing the channel structure, degrades it, simplifies it, and eliminates its capability of maintaining healthy environments for animals that live in the water or the quality of that water. So all of these things have to be understood when it comes to understanding watersheds and the impact of changes to that hydrology in the water cycle. When we disrupt the valley system, and this gets back to some of the things Zach mentioned, connectivity and linking. Connectivity is just as important in aquatic systems as it is in terrestrial systems. There's an enormous movement of aquatic life in and out of tributaries, up and down main systems. Historically, that was the case. We have put huge numbers of small dams and ponds and so on in a lot of these streams, which has affected the ability of animals to find life stage areas. We also alter what I call in-channel processes, bed load transport, sediment, geometry of the channel, and so on. We alter the ability of the river to interact with its riparian zone and floodplain, which means less nutrients and sediment are captured in these riparian areas. It means poor water quality. And finally, we lose the structure and functions provided by those riparian zones, and all of that leads to a poorer outcome for us as well as the environment. So I'll just take another 3 or 4 minutes to show you some of the work we have done. And this gets back to that process that Zack mentioned about rehabilitation. First, assessing the issue. In the case of this was a stream called Belgrave Creek near Wingham, where we had maybe a half a century of cattle access that had over-widened the channel. We went upstream to find a reference condition where the stream had not been altered for decades, and looked at how wide the channel wanted to be. Its width to depth ratio, we call that. We then went and tried to narrow the channel to that dimension, sloped it a little bit, got the cattle out of the stream, provided alternative water source for them, and replanted vegetation native to that area in the stream. And then we left it alone. Following year looked like this. Sorry, I should say 2 years later, it looked like this. This vegetation is growing, the grasses are growing, some of the trees are starting to grow. We saw a massive increase in aquatic life from the beginning to 2 years down the way, massive increase in the number of aquatic life. And this is at 20 years later. Somebody might have asked, when do you plan for rehabilitation? What's your timeline? I'm looking at 20 to 30 years out. I'm putting the system on a trajectory in the hopes that I will get to that lower left-hand corner, and it's in the case of this type of stream. Connectivity is another one that we do work on. This is an example of perched culverts, which prevent animal life moving up and down a system. In many cases, this is some work we do in Alberta, as well as Ontario, and trying to create abilities for animals to move in and out, up and down the system without barriers. Other barriers like old dams on river systems, we remove and work with geomorphologists and engineers so that we create a stable channel structure that allows it to change naturally. This is a day after the river, day after we removed that dam. This is 1 year after that dam was removed. This is 4 years after that dam was removed. So what we're trying to do is allow the system to renaturalize to a healthy functional state. This is one that's a bit closer to home. This is, I think, in Martin, Molly, and Patrick's backyard. This was the old dam site on Martin Creek. This is one that we worked with IJC, who are leaders in trying to restore this landscape and this waterscape. Dam was removed in October. We had challenges getting to the work any earlier than that. The stream was started to reestablish itself, but we had mud flats to worry about. However, there's a massive natural seed bank in those mud flats. So by June of the following year, it was growing up and stabilizing. If I were to look at that dam site, standing at the dam, looking up towards Highway 6, there's the dam. There's 1 year after we removed the dam with the vegetation growing in. This is 3 years later, and now you can hardly even see up through here. IGC has planted many trees and other shrubs in this area, and it's now becoming a far more natural area. And the channel and the stream is healthier for it. We've also done some work on, this is on Bronte Creek in Lowville, where the channel was loved to death by folks that love to build little rock weirs across the channel and cut the grass to the edge. We went into these areas and used bioengineering and other materials to help the river to narrow itself. After 1 year, it looked like this, and after 3 years, it's starting to look like this. We've also done work on other streams. There's a little spring creek up near Markdale that was grading. That means the stream was filling in because of old beaver dams and many undersized culverts. We removed the culverts, put spans in place. The beavers had not been there for decades, so we carefully pulled the dams, allowed the stream to renaturalize. And what we found is, even though we worked in the stream channel itself, once the water table, which had flooded the riparian forest and killed the riparian forest, once that water table dropped by about 6 inches, all the seeds and other material that were in there came back to life. and that riparian zone became vibrant within 5 years. So just to finish off, I just want to stress one thing, and this is something I think that Martin would like to stress, is that none of this works and can be achieved without working with people. Working with the people that live in those areas, because ultimately restoration and rehabilitation is about people. We require all sorts of management principles, but ultimately we need to learn how to talk with each other, to share our stories, and to understand that we could have something better. We need the context so people understand what they could have, and then we work with people and engage them, because ultimately it's the communities that resolve it. So I think it's unrealistic to think that we can bring everything back to historical conditions. The key thing I'm trying to do as much as possible is bring these natural systems back to as functional a state as possible by understanding where the problems lie, trying to solve those problems directly, resolving the cause of these areas, and then integrating those knowledges and working with the local communities. And I will stop there. I'm sure there'll be some questions in a bit.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jack. It's great to see all of those pictures as well. So I'd like to introduce our final speaker of the evening before we move into our Q&A session, Theodore. Theodore is a band member of Wikwemikon Unceded Indian Reserve and a fluent speaker of the language. He works for the Department of Lands and Natural Resources in Wikwemikon as the Species at Risk Coordinator. The Species at Risk program became part of the Wikwemikon Land Department in 2007 as part of the Land Use Plan. His knowledge and education about the land comes from his parents and grandmother, who shared both the tools he needed to get where he is today and how important all things are to the Anishinaabe people. So I'd like to welcome Theodore to turn your camera on and go right ahead.
Yeah, like Molly said, I am an indigenous person, and I guess I got my lessons from my parents and my grandmother, whom I spend a lot of time with on the land. They taught me most of what I know now, and I didn't initially start it this way, knowing what I know now. I had an accident 20 years ago in regards to my health, and the Western medicines didn't help, and I ended up down in the United States to see a medicinal person, and I guess he helped me a lot to understand about the plants and their functions and how to talk to them and how to use them. So that journey started 20 years ago now, I guess I'm presuming. So I'll get into my presentation. Okay, awesome. Like I said, I'm more into my language, and I use English as my second language, so bear with me, please. So getting into it, I'll try and make this pretty quick. It's I usually lasts for about an hour, but I shorten it as much as I could, but I'll try and get through it pretty quick. Like I said, I work for the Wikwemikon Unceded Indian Reserve, and I am the Species at Risk Coordinator for the band. And we're trying to convert all our languages, or our whatever, like, back into the language, which the Lands Department is Wikwemikon, Ekemino, and then the Machik. And as mentioned, I work with the elders and medicinal people over the years that have prepared me for this journey. They have, like I said earlier, they have taught me all the things that are connected to each other, be it air, or water, or those that call it home. And translated, Wikwemkong Ancient Reserve Species at Risk Program is in the languages Wikwemkong Eke Nenizanak Wingoshkok. And this is one of the first flora that we went out and tried to look for. So Waldorfius, which grows along the water's edge, along the shores of Manitoulin Island. Is this species at risk? No, it is species at risk, but I think it's upgraded to special concern now because of the populations we have here on the reserve. And there's another species at risk here. We're not sure who it is. So the vision statement for our department and the species at risk species at risk program is that we conserve the land, water, environment, and for generations to come. In Wikwemkong, we have 26 species of various birds, could be birds, plants, and reptiles. We have an abundance of these. Blanding's turtle. In the spring, from June right till September, it's very common to see them along the roadway here. Rattlesnakes, Mississauga rattlesnakes, we have him here. Milk snakes, ribbon snakes, which is special concern. And snapping turtles. As you know, they're all listed now. The painted turtle and map turtle we have here on the reserve. One of the birds that we used to have lots of here on our mainland, as well as our other reserve east of Killarney, is the whippoorwill. We're trying to do different stuff to try and get them back to here to the near the village, because we did have them near the village at one time. Common nighthawks. I think on the south end, we may have 7 mating pairs. Red-headed woodpeckers. In our language, the eagle, its name is Migiza. And of course, in our culture, that to receive one of the feathers from an eagle is one of the highest honors that a person can get. We have meadowlarks, bobolinks, Canada warblers, and golden wing warblers. Barn swallows, eastern wood pewees, or olive-sided flycatchers. We do have Houghton's goldenrod. The difference between it is that the Houghton's got a flat head and narrow leaves as compared to the common one. Gatherer's Agellinus. It usually flowers around start of September, and it's found along the rocky shorelines on the north end of our reserve. The difference is that the gatherers has a stem as versus the common one, which has no stem from the stalk to the flower. Ram's Head orchid. It usually flowers around late May, start of June. Notice how small it is. You have to practically get on your hands and knees to look for it. Blazing Star, rare in Ontario. One of our achievements when we were done that when we were done our inventory of our species at risk, we took that information down to the elders, and the elders they looked it over and they says, you know, you guys are doing great things up there in regards to plants, meaning that the land office. And then they said, have you, one of the things these guys missed is our own medicinal plants. Our medicinal plants are slowly disappearing, and I think it would be great if you could showcase those species at risk plants as well as our medicinal plants. So they got working on this book. I think this book came out must be 10 years ago now. And I had nothing to do with it. I just sort of steered it on how to fashion this book out. So this book I can't take credit for. It was all the work of our elders here. One of the other things that they had mentioned that around the same time period was revitalizing our wild rice. And it was a complete surprise to the lands office to find out that we had wild rice on our lands. So we went out and found out anything about it and where it was located. So about 2 years after that, they had mentioned this, the band sent us out to Wisconsin to do training on wild rice. I think about 2017 or somewhere around there, 2015, we had our first wild rice camp. It's something that is dear to us, our collection of our medicinal plants. This is something that, like I mentioned, I had no interest in until about 20 years ago when I ran into this little problem of mine. I think the elders they taught me for sure that how to connect with the plant and to listen to the plants. I think we should. It's not very hard to understand a plant. If you listen to the elders and those that have used that plant for a long time, you hear the stories they tell about those plants, you slowly start to what's the word? Appreciate that plant. And one of the elders' golden rule is that if it's put on here on Mother Earth for us to use, we shouldn't sell it at all. It's not for sale. My medicinal friend shared his information in regards to this plant, but he most of the guys that medicinal plants I run with, they usually come by the house and ask me to look for plants for them. This one, my friend, he wanted me to go harvest this for him. I don't want the white one, he said. I want the one with the yellow flower. So I looked for that thing for maybe a year and a half. And by the time I found it, it was in the fall of 2019, I guess. My friend had passed away, and he did not give me he didn't have the time to tell me what it was for. Some of the medicinal plants that we harvest here on the reserve is sweet flag. In the language, we call it wike. Yarrow. In the language, it's called zidmozonak, which means squirrel still, because it does look like a squirrel still. Oh. And wild ginger in the back, the one at the bottom there. We call it meppen in our language. Bone set, it's called Rasho Bok Sing in our language, which means the leaf, the stem comes through the leaf. Penny Royale is on the right there. It's called Meshkos. It has a story of its own. Why it's called Meshkos? Because in our language, sturgeon, the name of the sturgeon is Meh. And Shkos, it means little weed, little plant. So anyway, the story is that whenever the sturgeon was sick, it would crawl up on the land and harvest this for whatever was ailing them. Plantain, Pashkadagan, it means you're going over it all the time. Okay. Burdock, more medicinal plants, wild raisin, pearly everlasting, wintergreen, traditional ecological knowledge. I think it's been in the foundation of our program since the onset of it, which is 2007. A relationship has been formed with other communities along the North Shore as well as in the United States. I travel with this presentation, which is the longer version of this, to the north of Northern Ontario as well as into the United States, as well as Southern Ontario. I think for the help they give us each spring, or maybe around June, late June, we invite our elders to a picnic for the information that they have given us in appreciation for that information. Yeah, we usually have a big fish fry. Community outreach, we do that before COVID existed. We used to go into the classrooms and present to our kids on our plants. We go through how they function, what our elders used it for, how it grows, where it grows. We even took out exchange students from South Africa one time. They were over at the Elder Center, and they said when they found out we were going out, they said they asked if they could accompany with us, and we said sure, why not? And one interesting thing we found out is that they have the same they say they have the same kind of plants, and they're used for the same medicinal purpose. We have yet to know the species of this one. One of the greatest achievements that this program has developed was to start a working group. We started a group maybe 5 years ago. It consists of elders. I think there's about 5 youth in it, and those people that are between those ages. So in total, I think I have 17 members. I guess we used to meet once a month, and then they would come up with the ideas what to do, on how the program should proceed, who to visit. This is just one of the greatest things that this program has achieved was that group. This picture's from geez, I forget his name. Cape Croker. Some more pictures of that group. One of the things that we kept hearing from our elders was to put together an eco trail, which we did, and it's designed exclusively for the enjoyment of our guests, and has very minimal impact on our biodiversity of the land. And it provides a traditional knowledge to experience the way it was. That's one of our elders on the northern side of our reserve. There's a couple of plants in that elder that are only found there, as well as some other islands on the North Shore. So a couple of years ago, the elders wanted to build something, a trail, like I mentioned, and we decided to build a trail from to that point in the center there of the marsh. We put a viewing deck there, and pardon me, and a cat. The boys, they put up nests for to invite the osprey back. What changes have we seen occurring over the years? Climate change, that is our number one thing that we've seen that has changed over the land. Will all things be affected with climate change? It certainly will be. The elders have the stories that they've been telling us about the way it was. It's way, way different now. The land has transformed in so many ways that sometimes they don't even recognize where they grew up and what they use that land for. It doesn't look the same anymore. And they believe that it's the indigenous people that will be more susceptible to it. Snowfall, bird migration, water levels affecting growth in the uplands. Those are all the things that they have noticed. I was doing a presentation at the elders center one time, and they noticed that there was something missing in my presentation, and it was something for water. Water is our lifeline. If there's no water, we would not exist. When we, as people, come into this world, it is water that brings us out of the womb. Women are caretakers of the water because of our birth. Water is sacred. It sustains us all. There are 4 sacred types of water: birth, rain, sap water, and the water that comes off the leaves from the dew. Water has spirit. And again, I promised an elder that I would install this into my program, and it is very heartfelt. It drives a point into you really think about it, and it has something to do with oil rice, but I think it could mean it will fit into other things. What he said to me was that when the Anishinaabe looks out on the lake with rice, he sees not just the lake, but they see water that's life-giving, rice and other plants that are medicinal and provide sustenance for the people as well as all animals that live there in and on that lake. They see muskrats, beaver, fish, waterfowl, eagles, and many more. But most importantly, they see all these creatures have spirits and how they are kept in harmony and balance. I feel the presence of my ancestors on the lake while I am ricing. Eagles that are present on the rice beds show us that they are looking after the rice. Although ricing is a chore, I feel refreshed when it's done. When I get done ricing, because I get a chance to be with the spirits on the lake. And one of the other indicators that time is changing is beaver lodges have satellite dishes on them. And with great thanks, this is one of my teachers. She's taught me a lot of things about the land. and how everything is connected. She's the one that taught me that when you're out medicining, when you first start off, you give thanks. You give thanks to that medicine that you are picking. She taught me, and you don't pick till it's all gone. You listen with your heart, your mind. That those plants, they'll tell you that it's you know this. You've picked it up from this area. Go pick somewhere else, and in the end, the plants will talk to you that it's time that you have enough here to do for the winter. Nowadays, there's people that don't have that gratitude for that plant. We must connect with those, with even a tree. I was told that you don't pick medicines after a certain hour, 2 or 3. You gotta let that plant rest. After 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's time for it to rest. It's not, you don't go there and hack away at it and remove whatever you want from it. You respect that. Anyway, we're moving on. Always moving forward, either by land or water. That is one of the logos for our department. And I think that it's one of the greatest things that the land department has done was moving ahead. And with that, miigwech.
Theodore, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for Zack, and thank you to Jack as well. I feel when there's so much to think about in one session, it's kind of it's overwhelming. And sometimes we feel as though that we don't give ourselves permission to move ahead with something because we feel as though we don't know enough, but that there's no end point, right? There's always this journey in where you're learning more and more each year. What I appreciated what you presented at the end, Theodore, as well, is just taking a closer look at all those species and celebrating and reminding ourselves of why we do this. Yeah, it's not just a selfish act of our planets dying in front of our eyes because of our own actions, and we need to look after ourselves. But with when we consider all our relations and think about all those things as we do it, then there's something really to celebrate and to be grateful for, and to walk gently. I love what Zack brought and what Jack brought, and both of you, because you could also, when you walk in landscape and you walk by rivers, you start to see them in different ways. You start to see the interactions. You start to see the dynamics of those streams. That's one thing about difference about planting forests and working with streams, is how dynamic those stream systems are. So to see that pond and to see the system now at the Jesuit Center in such a short time, it feeds you. Even when you're working in the stream, you can see the results of your actions almost instantaneously, and just to see that life that come back. And from those perspectives, one thing I'm reminded of when we're taking care of the land, it's bringing the spirit back. It's bringing the life back. It's bringing the diversity back. It's bringing the relationships back. And what Theodore spoke about is bringing the languages back as well, because those languages are so tied to the relationships of these plants, and it's something we can't lose. So I'm so grateful to all of you for the work you do and the attention you spend on that and the commitment you have on that. So I'm super grateful. I'm grateful that people are stuck around. I know we've run out of time, but I think Patrick was going to present one question that kind of would bring some of all this together, that maybe each of the presenters can maybe speak to. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Patrick, and thank you, Molly, for keeping things running and keeping things together. So over to you, Patrick. And also,
sure, thank you, Martin. And then if everyone, all of our presenters could turn on their cameras as well, that would be great. So I am just going to make this pretty quick because I'm hoping we can be done by 8:30. And then if we have any follow-up questions or anything that's left in the chat, we will send them to our presenters, and then we will put those as part of the answers in the email that we send out. So my question for each of you is going to be the same, and it builds off of what Martin was saying, because you guys have brought so much knowledge forward to us for us to access. And obviously it takes a whole bunch of time to actually get to the point where you have that. So how would someone who doesn't hold all of that information take their first steps in caring for the land without feeling like they'll do more harm than good? I'd like to start with Theodore and kind of work backwards through our presenters. So Theodore, do you have thoughts on that?
I think how I started was I guess an elder was my big inspiration on there. He basically said there is no right or wrong on how to proceed and how to manage anything that's out there, if that makes any sense.
Sorry, Patrick's Zoom just froze. So Jack, would you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, building on what Theodore said, one of my elders was my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who spent a lot of time with me as a little boy, showing me things and explaining to me how things worked from his perspective, because he spent a lot of time on the land and on the water as well. And then I have had other elders, those being professors and other conservationists, that took me under the wing also. And then reading. For those that really want to get a sense of the spirit of land, there's some wonderful, many indigenous books. Braiding Sweetgrass is an absolutely spectacular book that I read recently. Another book that's written by one of the first ecologists in the US was Aldo Leopold's book, a series of short stories called the Sand County Almanac, which it doesn't talk about spirit, but everything he writes about is the spirit of the land and water. So I think if you start with those and try to get somebody to help mentor you, working with another person that's done a lot of this work, and just tagging along, you will learn a great deal.
Thanks, Jack. And then Zach, do you have anything to say on this?
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree with Jack and Theodore. And I think personally, one thing that I've really gained a lot from is just kind of exploring my own backyard and trying to think about how to incorporate ecology just, where I live around my house, in my yard. It's sort of like my own little space for experimenting, trying to figure out what species will work, under my Norway maple, which is notoriously hard to plant stuff under, because not everyone has the opportunity to get out and explore spaces or do things like what we're doing right now and having these discussions. So, for me, I think just, exploring your own space, your own backyard, and making the most of that space, to whether it's attracting pollinators by planting flowers or creating a rain garden. I think that's your own little, sort of laboratory, if you will. So that's what I would encourage people to do, how to get involved. And just to add to Jack's reading list, I would highly recommend the Once and Future Great Lakes Country. It's sort of an ecological history of the Great Lakes, at least the last few hundred years. And that's just loaded with incredible information and is a really great read.
Yeah, John Riley's book. John did a great job.
Yeah, fantastic read. So there.
All right, thank you so much. I wish we had more time for questions because I have a whole bunch, but you know, we've got to be respectful of people's time, so I'm going to pass it on to Martin.
Yeah, thank you. Get out there, just spend time in the landscape, be very observant, and keep watching the same space over a long time, and just and start that journey of learning. And as you come back every year, you'll know more. And it's just, be kind to yourself, be kind to each other, and be kind to the land around us. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thursday night, those who have signed up, we'll be looking at collaboration and creative ways of engaging people in landscape, because it needs all of us to do this work. Lots of gratitude. Thanks, Jack, Theodore, Zach, Molly, Patrick. Good night, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.